Good afternoon, guys, and welcome back to U.S. History 10. Today we're going to finish up where we left off last week with the very end of the Civil War, and today we're going to move into Reconstruction. My goal for today before we end this lesson is to completely wrap up with Reconstruction. That way next week, our very last week together, we can go completely into industrialization, which is a fascinating topic to go through considering the implications of industrialization, the impact that that's going to have on the 20th century, and of course the evolutions of the modern 20th century with inventions, medicine. A lot of really neat stuff comes out of that, so we're going to spend a lot of time on that next week. But for this week, guys, we're going to move back into the end of the war, talk very quickly because I had to rush through that last week. But what we're going to do real quick, talk very quickly about how the war ended and talk about Lincoln's assassination, and then move into the next step. After the war is over with, Lincoln has, of course, lost his life to this assassin, which we're going to talk about here in just a moment. The country's got to be put back together, and that's going to be the goal of Reconstruction. Now, at the end of the war, guys, one of the biggest things to come out of the end of the war is going to be the passage of the 13th Amendment. I mentioned this last week, and this is going to be huge because the passage of the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery throughout the United States. Now, remember, we talked about the Emancipation Proclamation. That does not end slavery in the United States. That simply abolishes slavery where it already existed in states that had been taken over by the Union. This completely gets rid of slavery, and this is essentially was the goal of many Republicans and the abolitionists for years as we talked about that abolition movement. But we'll talk about these amendments more in just a moment. Now, another thing that we're going to see towards the end of the war is civilians having to move into different realms of life. You have men that have been working as soldiers for 3 or 4 years at this point. That had kind of become the norm. So now they've got to acclimate themselves back into normal life. Now, not all citizens are going to stay where they're at. Some citizens, especially African Americans, will move westward. Unfortunately, we don't get to talk about that with you guys, but we talk about a whole group that move westward called the Exodusters as more land opens after the Civil War. Because again, even though slavery's been abolished in the South, and we'll see this here in just a little bit, there's still going to be a lot of problems and complications for African Americans as we move into the Reconstruction era. Now, we talked about Clara Barton, talked about her during the Civil War. Clara Barton, just to kind of add to civilians follow their own paths, Clara Barton, she's actually going to found the Red Cross in 1881. So we see a lot of positives coming out, especially with the revolution in medicine during this time period. Now, this is where we really finished up last week, and this is what I wanted to go back to real quick because the assassination of Lincoln, this is a massive event in American history. Lincoln being the 16th president of the United States, he's able to accomplish a lot. He has a crisis presidency, pretty much his whole presidency, like we mentioned before. Crisis begins right after he's elected president, continues all the way until his assassination in April of 1865. Now, I wish I could spend a lot more time on the assassination of Lincoln because this is a very complicated plot. And we talk about Lincoln, we always talk about his assassinator, Booth, John Wilkes Booth, but it's much deeper than that. He wasn't acting alone. There was a whole ring of Confederacy conspirators that actually were trying to not only assassinate Lincoln, but other members of his cabinet to possibly try to bring down the U.S. government at this point. The war cause was pretty much over, but you still have these Confederate sympathizers that are still holding on to that. Now, how the assassination plays out, President Lincoln and his wife, they decide to go to the theater one evening on April the 14th, 1865. They go down to Ford's Theater, which is not very far from the White House. Going to Ford's, they're conducting a play called Our American Cousin. And unfortunately, John Wilkes Booth had very good access to the theater. He was an actor himself. He knew this theater like at the back of his hand. And like modern presidents, during this time period, we didn't necessarily have a Secret Service. Lincoln might have had some guards, but there wasn't really someone standing around his box making sure that someone doesn't come in to attack him. So John Wilkes Booth actually jumps into the box, shoots Lincoln in the back of the head, jumps from the presidential box to the stage and flees. This turns into an all-out manhunt for John Wilkes Booth over about a 3-day period. He eventually is going to be caught by Union troops, and he's actually going to be shot in a barn. He actually dies from his injuries, so he doesn't actually get a trial, but he doesn't make it very far from this plot. And when it all starts to unfold, there's 14, 15, 16 different people that are involved in this, men, women. It's a very interesting. If you ever want to find more information about that, just go to fordstheater.org. They've got a lot of information, and that's, of course, where it happened. So this is the center focus point, of course, of their theater and their museum. So President Lincoln's assassinated in April of 1865, and we know that whenever a president dies or is assassinated, this is actually the first president in American history to be assassinated. We've had other presidents die in office. Zachary Taylor died in office, and we've seen presidents, of course, in William Henry Harrison, and of course we've seen the vice president move up into the presidential position. So this is kind of where we're at. We're in the spring of 1865. The country, we've got to pull the country back together. Lincoln's just been assassinated. The country's essentially in mourning. We've gone through the Civil War. The president's dead. Now we got to figure out how to put everything back together. So this is where we get to the point of Reconstruction. This is where we get to the point of figuring out how to put the country back together and bring the Union into a solidified state again. Now, before Lincoln's assassination, he had already come up with ideas about how Reconstruction was going to work. And Lincoln's plan, the biggest one that we hear about, is his 10% plan. And basically what this plan looks like, guys, is that the 10% plan wants 10% of the voting individuals within these former Confederate states, once they agree to allegiance in the Union or back to the Union, then these states could come back into the Union. Now, when you think about that, that's not a really big, you think about trying to punish people for what they did. And that's what a lot of people want to do at this point. A lot of people want to punish Confederates, of course, for starting this war. And a lot of people think this is kind of lenient. And we'll talk more about that in just a few moments. And basically what Lincoln, again, his proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction called for 10% allegiance in these Confederate states, then they could come back into the Union. The problem with Lincoln's plan, guys, is the radical Republicans. This guy right here, Thaddeus Stevens. Not just Thaddeus Stevens, other guys, Charles Sumner. If you remember maybe talking about Charles Sumner a little bit further back when we were talking about the politics of the mid-1800s, the 1850s. He was the one that got beat with a cane on the Senate floor, if you remember anything about that. That's another interesting story in American history. But these radical Republicans, they're going to be the ones leading the charge. They want to punish the South for what they did. They want to punish the Confederates. They want to punish these Confederate leaders. And they want to make it very difficult for anyone that held allegiance to the Confederacy to be able to come back into the United States. So the radical Republicans, not only did they push for that, but they really want to destroy the power of the former slaveholders. That's who they blame the war on. The war, essentially, it was about states' rights, but it's about the states' rights to have slavery. And they wanted to punish these guys, of course, for pushing everyone into this war. But another big push that we see here is not only the idea, we see the 13th Amendment, that abolishes slavery, but we also see the radical Republicans, they're starting to make the pushes forward to actually bring African Americans fully into citizenship in the United States. If we go back, 1857, the Dred Scott case, that court case deemed that African Americans were not citizens of the United States. So we've got to actually make African Americans citizens of the United States, and that's what the radical Republicans are going to try to do. Now, even before the war effort was over with, the radical Republicans were making this push to try to, of course, punish former slaveholders and reconstruct society the way that they feel like it needs to be reconstructed. Now, this first bill, the Wade-Davis bill, they try to pass this. They do actually pass it through the House and through the Senate in 1864. It was a very radical plan for Reconstruction. But this is before Lincoln's assassination. He wants to run Reconstruction, so he actually pocket vetoes that bill. Basically, he lets the bill sit on its desk, and it vetoed out. They can't do anything with the bill. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but we don't have to go into that all now. But basically, the bill is going to die on Lincoln's desk, so it doesn't pass. Now, that's the first bill that they try to get passed and, of course, get Lincoln to sign. But his proclamation, his Amnesty Act, is the one that is going to essentially go into effect. But Johnson's got his own plans for Reconstruction as well. So let's take a look at some of Johnson's plans. Now, let me take a step back for a second. Who is Andrew Johnson? Andrew Johnson is Lincoln's vice president. He's the guy that takes over for Lincoln after Lincoln's assassination. We talked about that a minute ago. Now, Andrew Johnson, he proposes his own plans for Reconstruction. Here are the provisions. The states must swear allegiance, and so they've got to swear allegiance to the Union again. They've got to annul all of their war debts, basically get rid of their war debts. And another thing that they have to do is ratify the 13th Amendment. What do we mean by ratifying the 13th Amendment? Hopefully you remember that term from back when we were talking about the Constitution and, of course, ratified amendments to make them a part of the Constitution. When you ratify something, you approve it. So basically they're wanting the states to approve the 13th Amendment to show that they agree with the abolition of slavery. Now remember, you only have to have so much percentage of votes in Congress, of course, to get a bill passed, but of course it has to be ratified by the states. I'm sorry, not a bill, but an amendment to be added to the Constitution or the Constitution to be amended. The people have to agree that as well. So that's what that ratification process looks like. A little bit more complicated than that, but that's the gist of that. Now, one of the big problems, though, with Johnson's plan that a lot of the radical Republicans have issues with is the fact that it doesn't address voting rights, land, or laws for former slaves, so it doesn't help them out much. And basically, what's going to happen is that all of these states that didn't come under the 10% plan under Lincoln are going to be able to come under Johnson's terms. And Lincoln's plans were pretty lenient when it comes to Reconstruction and allowing these former Confederates to come back into the Union. Johnson's plan is a little bit more lenient than that. And again, this is where we're going to start to see some big issues pop up between Johnson's administration, this plan for Reconstruction, and the plan that the radical Republicans that they have in place in Congress. Now, when it comes to Johnson's plans, not all of the states are going to comply to this because there's going to be a lot of pushback. Now, before we go into anything else, what I want to take a moment, because we're kind of condensing some of this information down today, but what I want to do real quick, guys, is look at major Reconstruction legislation. How is this legislation going to play into the changes that's going to happen during Reconstruction? So I'm going to start at the top and we're going to work our way through and talk about what each one of these pieces of legislation did to possibly improve the lives of African Americans after Reconstruction, because not only are we trying to rebuild society, and we'll talk about that more about the physical rebuilding of society, but we are trying to create a whole new world, essentially, for a whole group of individuals that have been formerly enslaved, for 200-300 years at this point in this country. So there's a lot that has to be thought about. It's more than just putting the pieces back together. We're having to create a whole lot of different things to, of course, accommodate and to bring these individuals into American society. So the first piece of legislation, we see this from 1865 to 1866, is the Freedom Bureaus Act. And what this did, this offered assistance such as medical aid and education to freed slaves and war refugees. Again, once this war is over with, formerly enslaved individuals, they're having to start new lives for themselves, and that's what the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be there to do. Now, the next major piece of legislation that's passed is going to be the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And what this did was granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to African Americans. Now, this is important because it does offer citizenship, but it's not ever passed fully. And unfortunately, if it's not passed through Congress fully, and of course, it doesn't get the support that it needs, and it's not, well, it does go through Congress, but it can't be reinforced, And that's one of the big issues here. If it cannot be reinforced, then it's doing no good. That's where the 14th Amendment is going to come into play, and it's not even going to be fully ratified into law, of course, until 1868. But what the 14th Amendment did, and this is very important. So to take a step back for a second, we think about the major amendments that come out of the Reconstruction era. 13th Amendment, that's the big first one because, of course, that abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment, this is what actually grants citizenship to African Americans. This completely wipes Dred Scott off the books, and this is where we're going to see citizenship become the norm. And this is what the provisions say. It says, makes all persons born or naturalized. Someone that is naturalized, that's someone that becomes a citizen. They go through the citizenship process. So anyone born or naturalized in the United States becomes citizens. It stipulates that states that prevented male citizens from voting could lose a percentage of their congressional seats. It barred most Confederate leaders from holding political office. So this is where we start to see some of that radical republicanism start to play out here, especially with those provisions about most Confederate leaders cannot hold political office. Trying to punish these guys, not let them back into office and into control. The radical Republicans want to have control, and that's a big provision there. So the 14th Amendment is huge. This grants rights, of course, of citizenship to African Americans and anyone else that's naturalized, born or naturalized in the United States. All right, so the last three major pieces of Reconstruction legislation that we need to talk about is the Reconstruction Act of 1867. What this did, guys, this actually abolished governments that were formed in the former Confederate states. So this is basically wiping those governments off the map and basically putting everything back into place how it was before. Because again, you had governments set up prior to the Civil War. They kind of get pushed out for the Confederate government. Now we're trying to put it back into terms of how it should have been prior to the Civil War. So it abolishes those governments formed in the former Confederate states, but it also divided the states into 5 military districts. You'll see a map of that in just a second. And that sets up requirements for readmission into the Union. So I'm going to go to the next slide real quick so you can see this as we're talking about this. So what we're going to see is we're going to see all of the states that had not already come back into the Union under Johnson or Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. This is what they're going to have to deal with. The reason for this, guys, that they break them up into military districts is to make sure that Reconstruction laws are being reinforced in these states. You have military set up in these states that can enforce these laws, and that's going to be a positive for a bit in these southern states. Once Reconstruction laws are enforced, African Americans are allowed to vote, they're allowed to exercise their rights, but unfortunately that's not going to last. That peace that we see under the military control is not going to last very long for African Americans as we get deeper into Reconstruction. Now, another one of the 3 major pieces of Reconstruction legislation that comes out as we talk about these amendments is the 15th Amendment. And that's going to be ratified in 1870. And this states that no one can be kept from voting because of race, color, or previous servitude. Now, I want you to notice something that's missing about that, and this is very important because we're actually going to celebrate this anniversary this June. We don't see anything about women in here. We don't see anything about sex. We see race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but we don't actually see anything about someone's sex, if they're male or female, because women don't actually gain the right to vote until 1920. So we're going to see that actually the 100th anniversary of that happen. So this is a step in the positive direction as far as for African American males having the right to vote. So you can imagine African American women didn't have the right to vote, but the males in the situation did have the right to vote. But again, that's across the board. Women don't have the right to vote for a very long time. But why is this so important? Why is it so important for the 15th Amendment to be passed? And of course, for these African American males that have the right to vote, because now they have a say-so on what's going on in their government. They have that voice, which we're going to see why that's vitally important here in just a few moments. Now, another major provision of Reconstruction legislation that we see is the Enforcement Act of 1870. And what this did, it protected the voting rights of African Americans and gave the federal government power to enforce the 15th Amendment. So again, being able to enforce that amendment, making sure that African American males have their right to vote, that's what's going to be vitally important, because especially for the radical Republicans. We'll see more about that in just a moment. All right, so we talked about our military districts. I don't think we need to go any further into that. But let's talk a little bit about an impeachment and an election here. This is something that is very much, let me put this way, very relevant to our times. Even though the impeachment trial is over, we just went through an impeachment trial within the United States for, of course, President Donald Trump. We saw with that impeachment trial how that played out. It started in the House brought the charges. They, of course, are going to figure out if there's enough charges there to actually indict the president, impeach the president, and then the trial is going to go to the Senate. We've seen this play out in just within the past year. So this is something, hopefully, if you paid attention to the news, you might be a little familiar with. But the first president in American history that's going to be impeached, and remember, one of the key things that I tell my students every year when I ask, what does impeachment mean? Removed out of office. Not quite. You're not being removed out of office. You're simply being put on trial for a crime, okay, a crime that you committed while in office, okay? So you're not being removed. But Johnson will be put on trial. But why is he put on trial? He was impeached, Clinton was impeached, now Trump. So we've had 3 presidents to be impeached. And remember, Nixon was never impeached because he resigned from office before he was impeached. So let's talk about Johnson's impeachment. So Johnson is actually put on trial with formal charges of misconduct in office. What he did, he actually fired someone in office that went against an act that had been passed through Congress called the Tenure Act. He actually fired the Secretary of War, Edward Stanton, and that was a pushback because Edward Stanton was a leftover kind of from the Lincoln administration. He'd been in Lincoln's office, cabinet. He'd been a part of that administration, so he was kind of a leftover, had conflicts with Johnson. Johnson was a Democrat. So that's a big thing. You got to remember, Lincoln was a Republican, Johnson was a Democrat, so there was some pushback there, of course, from the Republicans that are trying to get this legislation passed through Congress. So these House radicals, these radical Republicans in the House, they try to impeach Johnson. They want to impeach him. They want to bring charges against him because he's pushing the limits. He's trying to push these radical or these Republicans out of office, or he's pulling Republicans out of office. Now, the House does impeach him. They do, of course, find enough to try him, but the Senate does not convict. One vote. One vote is what kept Johnson from being convicted, and he did stay in office. Now, for Johnson, that doesn't do a lot as far as the rest of his political career. He will not run for re-election. Actually, he was never elected. He came into the position, and he will only serve one term as president as a result. Now, the gentleman that's going to come to the presidency next is a guy that we all are familiar with at this point because we talked about him quite a bit during the Civil War, and that's Ulysses S. Grant. And just note, very quickly, I'll plug this real quick. There's a great documentary coming up on Ulysses S. Grant over Memorial Day weekend on the History Channel. So if you're interested in that, find out more about Grant and his service as not only a leader for the military, but also as president, that might be something good to watch. Now, Ulysses S. Grant is elected president in 1868. He's elected, he's a Republican. Why does he win the presidency when he has no prior political experience? He's a general. He was a very strong general, a very strong leader. A lot of people had hope, they had faith in him, that he could lead the country out of this mess that we were in at this point with Reconstruction. So Grant's going to be elected president. He's going to win. And one of the things that's going to help him win this election is going to be the passage of the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, what that does, again, that allowed African-American males the right to vote. And most African-American males were actually Republicans. So those votes, especially even in the South, are going to go to Grant, which helps him win the war, that many more votes for him. Now, things start getting rough, though. Once Grant is elected president, we start to see some more problems emerge in the South. The South's not enforcing the 14th Amendment or the 15th Amendment. We start to see white Southerners actually use violence to prevent blacks from voting. We'll see that more with the KKK in just a moment. And it gets so bad that this is where the Enforcement Act of 1870 comes into play. Grant, of course, pushes this. They push this through Congress. Grant's going to sign it and basically says, anybody that violates the 14th or 15th Amendment that does not allow these individuals to have their rights, they can be punished for this, and the federal government can do that. Again, we're going to see a lot of pushback in the South from a lot of Southern Democrats as the radical Republicans gain control and push out this radical, what they consider radical legislation through the 1860s and 1870s. All right, so very quickly, guys, let's talk a little bit about reconstructing society. I'm going to go ahead and put everything up here on the screen for us because this is where we're going to finish up today. We're going to finish up here. We'll talk about the struggles at the very end of Reconstruction and finish up with industrialization next week. So when we talk about reconstructing society, let me get that out right. There's a lot of problems in the South. Like I said earlier, it's not just, of course, the infrastructure that needs to be built, but there's a lot of things socially that has to be built as well. Now, that term infrastructure, let's talk about that. What do we mean by infrastructure has to be rebuilt? Roads, telegraph lines, railroads, all of these things that help the country run or help a city or town or whatever run, those things have been destroyed in a lot of towns in the South, so that's going to have to be put back together. And we start to see public work programs starting to pop up to improve conditions in the South. But it's going to get a little bit worse when it comes to conditions in the South, especially when it comes to politics, guys. Politics are becoming very strained, and this is where we're really going to see this next week with the political strains as we get a little bit deeper into that. But politics are strained in the South. We've got people, these scallywags, these white Republicans in the South that are pushing back a bit against the white Democrats. The Democrats were pretty much former slaveholders. They're pushing back, and they're called, and most of these guys are small farmers. They want better economic conditions for themselves. So they're not trying to, really push back too much against the authority. They're just wanting to, of course, find some financial strength for themselves. But in the South, too, you've got this other group of individuals coming in called carpetbaggers. These are Northerners coming out to the South to try to help improve society at this point. Now, again, not all of them were there with good intentions, but the majority of these individuals were. And all these groups are kind of at odds with each other at this point. So we only have about a minute left, but let's finish up, guys, and talk very quickly about African Americans as voters. You got to understand, this is what is going to help the Republicans stay in power at this point, is because they are the largest group of Southern Republicans. These African-American males that go out and vote and exercise their right after the 15th Amendment is passed, they're going to have a huge impact on keeping Republicans in office for a period of time. Now, the big picture here, guys, is to remember that varied political opinions over new won rights of African Americans had Southerners divided. And that's what we're going to pick up next week. We're going to go a little bit deeper into that. We'll talk about these struggles right at the end of Reconstruction that's going to lead to the downfall of Reconstruction, and then we'll move into industrialization. I hope you guys have a great rest of your Wednesday. And to all my Baker grads, coming up next, you're going to hear a nice announcement from Mr. Prue and see our top 10. So go Hornets, and I'll see you guys next week.